Let me start by pointing out that his two major works dealing with religious matters are his dialogues concerning natural religion and a natural history of religion. The dialogues are really about natural theology, the viability of the classic arguments for the existence of God, ontological, cosmological, teleological. And the thing is cast in the form of a dialogue with three characters, who represent, of course, three different positions. One of them somewhat sceptical, one of them sort of Lockean, and one of them something of a Platonic mystic. And therefore you get a very vigorous kind of debate. I don't want to go into the details of the argument. There's some comment on it in Stumpf, and you can explore it more fully if you want to in Copleston. I think it needs to be said that this is a full-scale critique of the claims of natural theology. A critique of the arguments as such. There's no theological objections to doing it that way. The objections is that the arguments don't work. The premises don't logically produce the conclusions. And from Hume's day until this, I think it's fair to say that there has been a mainstream in philosophy of religion which is agreed with that assertion, that the arguments are not sufficiently complete, conclusive, clear enough to prove the existence of a first cause, a rational designer, supremely good, and so forth. Now, that's not to say that the arguments don't have any weight at all. In fact, Hume himself, in the last section of the dialogues, admits that, yes, they do have considerable weight, and he seems to think that Cleanthes's position is the one he's most inclined to agree with. Because of the kind of impression, and impression is the word in Hume's technical sense of it, because of the impression that the ordinariness of nature, predictability and so forth has on us. So that from a rational, logical point of view, while the case is by no means clear, logically complete, it's not demonstrated, we don't have demonstrative knowledge of God, as Locke said, yet there seems to be something there which might evoke belief. Now, the dialogues are concerned then with the logic of belief. But the natural history of religion is concerned with the psychology of belief. And if you like, you can see the relationship between those two as established in the first section of the inquiry concerning human understanding, where he distinguishes between abstruse philosophy, with its attempt at logical proofs, and practical philosophy, the sort of things people live by, you see. And he intends this to be represented by the distinction between the logical arguments of natural theology and the psychological basis for belief, which he develops in the natural history affair. And just as in the first section of the inquiry, he says that what we need really is some combination of the two. So he seems to be saying with regards to matters religious. Notice what I said about the conclusion of the dialogues. They're dealing with the logic of the argument, but at the end he seems to appeal to the psychology of belief. You see. The logic sort of helps you to get clear about where you stand, although the psychological coercion that's involved in belief doesn't come from the logic, it comes from elsewhere. So the natural history of religion then is dealing with psychological factors that contribute to belief. He has the view that monotheism developed historically out of an earlier polytheism. Belief in one God developed out of a prior belief in many gods. And that, I think, because he finds polytheism easier to explain in terms of some natural psychological development. Because after all, as human beings, we have many different concerns common to all of our lives. We need to eat, we need food, we need some sort of security, peace, so forth. So that we have a variety of emotions, dimensions, areas of emotional life. And there are aspects of our experience within the world of nature which are likely, therefore, to leave impressions, emotional impressions. Impressions that give rise to the notion of a cause, a being, who is doing this. And so a variety of such concerns, such impressions, a variety of gods. Polytheism is a natural psychological development. Monotheism only develops, however, when the rational, the contemplative comes into play. And reflecting on many gods and so forth seems to give rise to some unanswered questions, possible problems. Because contemplatively we recognize that nature has something of an ordered unity about it. Contemplatively, we recognize this. And so we come to think of one being behind the ordered unity. That's the sort of line of thought that the pre-Socratics went through in metaphysics. Why is the one ultimate rather than many? You see. So he sees that in the dialogues, on the other hand, when the teleological argument gets to talking about the ordered unity of things, the response that Hume introduces through one of the other characters is, but it's our idea of a unity that's involved. How do we know there is that actual unity? It's we who combine the various simple ideas into the complex idea and get a unified world, you see. But while logically you cannot prove then the ordered unity of the world, you just know the ordered unity of your idea about the world. Complex ideas are not the originating ideas. Well, that's the case, yet psychologically, it's still a fact that reflection on that tends to move us from, accordingly, that historical development. Monotheism, he feels, is simply a rational conception, a speculative notion of natural religion resulting from natural theology. Monotheism, in that sense, isn't going to affect the imagination and produce those impressions, feelings, and consequently monotheism is likely to give way to some kind of a polytheism. You see. Now, historically, how do you get polytheism subsequent to monotheism? He is suggesting that the psychological train would naturally lead there. I think, in effect, what we have is rather monotheism as it loses its vitality, giving rise to what I'd call a secularistic polytheism. That is to say, a secular society that has its gods. Its god of money, its god of sex, its god of power. You see. That sort of thing, loss of any unified worldview. But in history, the fact is that while natural religion cannot long activate the life, what is needed is that there be some historical account of that one God active in history. Hume says that. And obviously he's referring to the Christian story of God active in history and the incarnation. So his point is that religious belief is produced by things that happen in human experience historically and in everybody's experience that arouse emotions, impressions, that give rise to ideas about the cause of what's happening. So a psychological account of religious belief. In the process of all of that, what Hume has done for the history of thought, the religion has been working with for the last 200 years. Namely, the concern to reconstruct theistic arguments that are indeed valid. The attempt to reconstruct theistic arguments. A discussion as to what sort of a God does natural theology point towards. The problem of evil, much more than previously. Because one of Hume's objections to the teleological argument, arguing from the ordered purposefulness of nature, is that evil represents dysteleology, lack of order, or at least lack of purpose, discernible purpose. And so the problem of evil came increasingly into focus. The relationship between reason and emotion in religion, obviously a crucial question. And that includes the question of the evidential value of religious experience, arguing from religious experience. And then finally, the question of the relationship between religion and morality. Because he argues that religion tends to divert people's attention from moral and social issues, that the moral outcomes of religious belief aren't at all uniform. He's not saying there are none, but they're not uniform enough. And that sort of question has given rise to attempts at moral arguments for the existence of God. Arguments for morality towards the existence of God. So the whole agenda, really, that you get into in the philosophy of religion course, really is an agenda that comes out of Hume's dialogues. The point being that so much of this was taken for granted as effectively handled by the scholastic tradition, that only gradually did it all re-emerge in need of fresh attention. Now, the new developments then in philosophy of religion are spurred by Hume, but don't say just Hume, you have to say Hume and Kant, as we'll see in the next 2 or 3 weeks, because by the time Kant is through with his critique of pure reason, he too has given a resounding critique of rational proofs, logical proofs for the existence of God. And he too feels that religious belief is based on something other than logical proofs. And by the time he's through with his writings on ethics, he's given us a moral argument for the existence of God. And by the time he's through with his writings about aesthetics and the beauty of nature, he's given us an aesthetic argument for the existence of God, but not logical proofs. What he does is something short of proof. Essentially, he's saying that the only way to explain moral and aesthetic phenomena is by means of the postulate that God exists. In other words, you need theism and a theistic worldview to give an adequate account of moral and aesthetic experience. But we'll see that as we get to Immanuel Kant. So let me pause there and see if there are things in this you want to toss around for a little while. Yeah, Troy.
I was wondering, when you said monotheism developed into polytheism,
Yes.
was he looking historically at Christianity and saying, Judaism, strict monism,
To Trinitarianism as a form of polytheism.
Yeah, and new development like Christian saints, or was it strictly just like,
Yeah, I'd have to double-check the text of the thing to make sure. I don't recall that in it. So that if I were answering off the cuff, I'd say no, this is simply an extrapolation from his psychological explanation of the rise of polytheism first. But let me check that text and get back to you. I was wanting to reread it on Monday morning anyway for another purpose. However, let me add this one other thing. When you get to Hegel, who's certainly no empiricist like Hume, his agenda is vastly different than Hume's, Hegel sees a historical dialectic at work in the history of religion, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where the thesis is polytheism, the antithesis is pantheism, the synthesis, which is the highest form of truth, is Trinitarianism.
incarnation?
Yeah, part of that, but the Trinity, 3 in 1, 1 in 3. So the question of the historical development of religion certainly is live in this general period, late 18th, early 19th century, around 1800. And Hume, in I think in a significant way, has a hand in spurring inquiry into the history of religion, you see, which previously had not been an interest. History generally is not an interest prior to about 1800. It's just part of what they call belles lettres, good writing. The historical method as a science begins to develop around 1800. In fact, Hume himself wrote a history of England, which is said to involve historical methods by virtue of which Hume might be called one of the first great historical thinkers, the beginnings of history as a science. Well, okay. Now, somebody else, David.
Isn't there a section, I think there's such a dialogue with two people, like Lucas responds, doesn't he see something like, even though we can't build causal connections for sure, we can still infer things about the nature of God, because as with other things in our series, we see that analogy.
Yeah, that I think is in the section called On a Particular Providence, which is about God. Yeah, and I think that's the same sort of line of thought as you get in the dialogues. Now, when he says infer, he doesn't mean logically demonstrate. You see? In fact, earlier on, when he's talking about the fact that we experience constant conjunctions and somehow or other conclude that there's a necessary connection, and he's already said there's no logical step involved, he uses the word infer for that transition. Infer in those contexts seems to be to mean a step that the mind takes, which may not be a logical step. You see? So I think that's the case in that thing on special providence. Yeah.
And when you say that people, after Hume caught in the philosophy of religion, you say that they're dealing with these issues, they're trying to establish certainty in these arguments?
It varies. It varies. There are some who are trying to provide demonstrative certainty, as Locke would call it. More generally, the appeal is to probability, which is putting them in the evidentialist camp. Okay, probability, the weight of evidence. Yes, and a lot depends there on the epistemology with which they're working. Now, you're going to be reading about Thomas Reid this next week, the Scottish realist. Reid categorically rejects the theory of ideas and impressions. He denies the whole business of representational knowledge. We have a direct awareness of material bodies, you see, which means that you don't argue from the idea of an ordered universe. You argue from an ordered universe, you see. And consequently, he can be much more positive about the outcomes of that. Now, while Reid gave some lectures on natural theology, he didn't do a lot of work in that area. But that Scottish realist tradition affected a lot of people who did. There was a Scottish theologian by the name of Robert Flint in the 19th century, very influential. His book, Theism, was widely used even 50 years ago. You can check it in the library if you like. And the Princeton theologian, Charles Hodge, whose systematic theology is still studied from about the 1860s. The philosophical framework he's working with is Scottish realism. You see. And so as you would expect for a Scottish realist, he's much more positive about the theistic arguments than somebody with John Locke's theory or David Hume's theory of ideas. Okay. They think they have certainties to start with. So it varies with that tradition. And I think that it's the Scottish realist tradition, represented perhaps by Charles Hodge, but others who came to America, which shaped the American evangelical apologetic that is oriented towards theistic arguments for the existence of God. Now, there are other kinds of American tradition and apologetics, but it came out of that reaction against Hume on the part of the Scottish realists. Okay. And some of you may know that Mark Nolan, in the history department, has done all sorts of historical research and publishing about the influence of Scottish realism on American evangelicalism. Essays galore. I'm not sure he has a book on the subject, but he's got parts of books on the subject. So if you do work with Mark Nolan, okay, you'll get into something like that. Incidentally, the Wheaton College president, J. Oliver Boswell, who was president, let's see, in the 30s, early 40s, was very much the Scottish realist. Very much the Charles Hodge sort of man. Very much so. So that influence was pretty evident right here at Wheaton. In fact, when I was an undergraduate here, I studied with a man who had been a student of Oliver Boswell's after Boswell left here and taught in seminary. So that my introduction to apologetics in college was the Scottish realist type. You see. Yeah. From which I have considerably strayed. Yes?
This is just something that what he was asking about what Hume said with the, I guess it would be more of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. It seemed to me, in this little dialogue he was having with his friend, what Hume said, his friend went through the speech and explained how we really couldn't infer God's existence or anything of the sort from our world. And Hume said, but why not? Because we see a half-built house, you assume that there's an intelligent builder and that he's going to bring it to completion of this sort of thing. And his friend answered, yeah, but the reason we can't do that with God is because we're dealing with two different mediums here. We're transferring our earthly knowledge with something we have no idea about. We don't have any impressions to relate to God. And so, in that sense, by Hume giving that friend's answer, whether it's his or not, I don't know,